we're remembering 10 R&B songs from 1963. Records that slipped into our lives during a year when soul music was beginning to find its voice across America. And the last song on tonight's list, it may be one of the most quietly unforgettable of them all. Let's begin with number 10. Number 10, Cry Baby by Garnet Mims and the Enchanters.
I'll take good care of you.
There are songs that announce themselves loudly, and then there are songs that simply arrive and stay with you. Cry Baby came into the world in 1963 with a voice that sounded like it had already lived 1,000 stories. Garnet Mims didn't sing this record so much as he poured it out. The opening lines carried a gospel weight that was impossible to ignore. At the time,
I'll take good care of you.
Rhythm and blues was leaning deeper into its church roots, and you could hear that spirit all through this record. The backing voices from the Enchanters answered him like a congregation behind a pulpit, lifting every word a little higher. One thing listeners always noticed was Mims' voice itself. It cracked just slightly in places, never polished, never perfect. But that imperfection gave the song its truth. You believed every line because it sounded like he meant every single one. For a lot of people, this wasn't just another R&B single on the radio. It was the kind of record you heard late at night when the house had gone quiet and thoughts had a way of drifting towards someone you missed. And once you heard that voice, it stayed with you longer than you expected. Number 9, If You Need Me by Solomon Burke.
If you need me.
Some songs don't raise their voices at all. They simply lean a little closer and speak straight to you. That was the feeling surrounding this record in 1963. While rhythm and blues was growing louder and more polished in some corners, Solomon Burke carried something older into the room, something that felt rooted in church pews and quiet conviction. Burke had a presence that was impossible to fake.
On me. All you gotta do is send for me.
Before he ever stepped into a recording studio, he had spent years preaching and singing gospel, and you could hear that background in the way he delivered every line. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just patience and weight behind the words. One small detail that many listeners remember is how steady his voice remained throughout the song. Even when the emotion rises, Burke never pushes. Instead, he lets the promise inside the lyric do the work. That calm strength made the song feel less like a performance and more like a vow.
That's why I know that one of these days it won't be long you'll come.
For people listening in 1963, the message carried a kind of quiet reassurance. Love in those days, like now, wasn't always simple. But hearing someone say, "If you need me, call me," felt steady and dependable. Like someone standing beside you without needing to prove it. Some records make an impression in the moment. Others feel like someone offering you their hand and meaning it. Number 8, Pride and Joy by Marvin Gaye.
I just love you, darling, like a baby.
If the previous song felt like a promise whispered in the evening, this next one arrived with sunlight. In 1963, the sound coming out of Detroit was beginning to take on a shine that would soon define a generation. Motown was refining its style, tight rhythms, crisp arrangements, and voices that carried both joy and confidence. Pride and Joy captured that moment perfectly.
My pride and joy, and a love like...
Marvin Gaye's voice had a natural warmth that made even simple lines feel personal. He didn't overpower the song. Instead, he danced right along with it, letting the rhythm section carry the groove while he floated just above it. There's a small moment in the recording that many musicians still admire. The way Gaye stretches certain phrases just slightly behind the beat. It's subtle, but it gives the entire record a relaxed swing that feels effortless. For young listeners at the time, this was the sound of happiness you could move to. The kind of record that played through open car windows, across summer streets, and out of little radios on front porches. It reminded people that sometimes love didn't have to be complicated. Sometimes, it could simply make you smile. Number 7. Part-Time Love by Little Johnny Taylor.
Lord, I've got to find me a part-time love.
Not every love song carries comfort. Some arrive with the quiet sting of realization. When this record began making its way across R&B stations in 1963, listeners heard something immediately familiar in Little Johnny Taylor's voice. It wasn't polished or dramatic. Instead, it carried the weary honesty of someone who had already learned a difficult truth. The early 1960s were a time when rhythm and blues was still deeply tied to the storytelling traditions of Southern soul and gospel.
And some hell bone, I'd rather be dead.
Part-Time Love fit right into that tradition. Simple arrangement, steady rhythm, and a voice telling a story that didn't need decoration. One thing that made the performance stand out was Taylor's restraint. He never pushed his voice into big theatrics. Instead, he let the disappointment inside the lyrics settle slowly into every line. You could hear the moment of understanding arriving as the song moved forward. For many people listening in 1963, the theme felt uncomfortably close to home.
But the next time my baby leave me.
Love wasn't always as steady as we hoped it would be. Sometimes it meant discovering you were only part of someone's life, not the whole of it. It was the kind of record you might hear on a quiet evening drive when the road is empty and certain thoughts start rising to the surface. And by the end of the song, you realized it wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about learning something you wished you didn't have to learn. Number 6, Mockingbird by Ines and Charlie Fox. If the last song carried a shadow, this next one arrived with a spark. In 1963, brother and sister duo Inez and Charlie Fox stepped into the studio and created something that felt wonderfully alive. Mockingbird had a playful energy that stood out on the radio, part call and response, part joyful conversation. R&B was beginning to experiment more with personality and spontaneity during this period, and you could hear it all through this recording. The two voices bounced back and forth like siblings laughing across the kitchen table. One memorable detail from the session was how loose the performance feels. Rather than sounding carefully polished, the song carries the feeling of musicians enjoying themselves in the room. The playful back and forth between Inez and Charlie became the heartbeat of the record. For listeners at the time, the song had a contagious spirit. It wasn't heavy or complicated. It simply invited you to smile, maybe tap your foot. Maybe sing along if no one was around. It was the kind of record that reminded people that music didn't always have to explain life. Sometimes it just made the room a little brighter. If you're still listening, you're probably one of us. Subscribing helps keep these old musical memories alive. Number 5, Heat Wave by Martha and the Vandellas. By 1963, something electric was happening in Detroit. Inside the small studio rooms of Motown, producers and musicians were shaping a new kind of rhythm and blues, one that carried the drive of gospel, the polish of pop, and the energy of a crowded dance floor. Heat Wave arrived right in the middle of that moment. From the first seconds, the record feels like it's already in motion. The drums push forward, the horns flare, and Martha Reeves steps in with a voice that sounds joyful and unstoppable at the same time. Reeves had a way of delivering a line that felt both powerful and inviting. She didn't overpower the band. She rode the rhythm like someone leading the celebration rather than standing above it. One detail that musicians often point out is the way the background singers answer her lines. The call and response pattern gives the song its spark, echoing the traditions of church music while keeping everything locked into that irresistible Motown groove. For many listeners in 1963, this was the sound of youth moving forward. Summer dances, crowded record hops, laughter echoing through gymnasiums and community halls. It reminded people that love didn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it came in like a warm wind, and suddenly the whole room was moving. Number 4, Be True to Your School by the Beach Boys.
I tell him right away, now what's the matter, buddy, ain't you heard of?
Now this next song carries a slightly different flavor of 1963. While rhythm and blues was evolving in cities like Detroit and Memphis, another sound was rising out on the West Coast. The Beach Boys were building a style that blended pop harmonies with the spirit of youth culture, and the result was something bright and unmistakable. Be True to Your School carried that sunny California energy, but underneath the cheerfulness was something deeper. Pride and belonging somewhere. Brian Wilson's arrangements were already becoming known for their layered vocal harmonies. On this record, those voices stacked together like waves rolling toward the shore, each part fitting neatly into the next. One interesting moment in the recording is the marching band style break that arrives partway through the song. It gives the record a playful burst of school spirit that made it stand out on the radio. For teenagers in 1963, it captured the feeling of being young in a changing world. Friday night games, crowded hallways, and the sense that your friends in your school were part of your identity. Looking back now, the song feels like a snapshot of a moment when life still seemed wide open. And for those who were there, hearing it again can bring back the sound of those hallways almost instantly. Number 3, Walking the Dog by Rufus Thomas. Some songs feel like they were born in the middle of a good laugh. Walking the Dog stepped onto the airwaves in 1963 with a kind of playful swagger that only Rufus Thomas could deliver. By that time, Thomas was already a familiar voice in Memphis, a performer who understood that rhythm and blues could carry humor just as easily as heartbreak. The record came out of the Stax studio environment, where musicians were building a sound that felt earthy, loose, and unmistakably Southern. You could hear it in the rhythm section right away. The groove didn't rush. It simply settled into place and invited everyone to follow along. One small detail that always stood out was Thomas's personality in the vocal. He didn't just sing the song, he performed it, tossing in little spoken phrases and playful inflections that made it feel almost like a conversation with the listener. For people hearing it in 1963, the song had a way of turning ordinary moments into something lighter. It was the kind of record that might drift out of a jukebox in a neighborhood cafe or bounce through the speakers at a weekend dance. And sometimes that was exactly what music needed to do. Not explain life, not solve anything, just make people smile for a few minutes. Number 2, It's My Party by Leslie Gore. If the previous song carried humor, this one carried something closer to teenage heartbreak. When It's My Party arrived in 1963, Leslie Gore was only 16 years old. Yet, the emotion in her voice captured a feeling that listeners of all ages understood immediately. The sudden sting of being embarrassed, disappointed, or left behind in front of everyone.
She don't know that she's a lucky girl.
The early 60s were full of carefully produced pop records, and producer Quincy Jones gave this one a polished shine. The rhythm moves briskly, the harmonies are tight, and the melody stays bright even as the story inside the song grows a little painful. One detail people often remember is the way Gore's voice rises on the chorus. There's a hint of vulnerability there, as if she's trying to stay composed while the feelings underneath threaten to spill over.
Maybe then he'll turn to me.
For young listeners at the time, the song felt like a moment from real life. Birthday parties, school dances, first crushes that didn't quite turn out the way we hoped. It reminded everyone that growing up meant learning how to handle small heartbreaks in public. And sometimes the only thing you could do was let the tears fall and hope tomorrow felt better. Number 1, A Fool in Love by Ike and Tina Turner. Sometimes a voice doesn't just sing a song, it breaks the door open. When this record found its way onto R&B stations in the early 60s, listeners heard something that felt different right away. Tina Turner's voice didn't glide smoothly over the music. It charged through it with a rawness that demanded attention. By 1963, rhythm and blues was beginning to lean toward a more intense emotional sound. And A Fool in Love carried that shift in full view. The band behind her kept a tight, pulsing rhythm, but it was Tina's delivery that made the song unforgettable. There's a moment early in the performance when her voice cracks slightly under the weight of the lyric. It isn't polished, and it isn't restrained. But that crack carried something powerful. The feeling that the emotion inside the song was too real to keep perfectly controlled. For listeners at the time, the record felt almost electric. Love wasn't always calm or steady. Sometimes it was confusing, overwhelming. Even a little reckless. And Tina Turner gave voice to that side of it without apology. Looking back now, the song stands as one of those moments where rhythm and blues took a step closer to the fiery soul music that would soon define the decade. And once you heard that voice, it was impossible to forget. The songs we've listened to tonight came from a single year, 1963. But the truth is, music like this doesn't stay in one year. It travels with us. Through different houses, different cars, different chapters of life. Maybe you first heard one of these records in a crowded room full of laughter. Maybe it came through a small radio late at night. Or maybe it simply found you at the exact moment you needed to hear it. That's the quiet gift of songs like these. They don't disappear. They wait. And when we hear them again, the years in between seem to soften just a little. Thank you for spending a little time remembering with me tonight. And if these songs brought back a few memories, you're always welcome here. Subscribing simply helps keep these old musical stories going. On the screen in front of you, there's another journey waiting. 10 Greatest R&B bands you've never heard of, hidden gems from 1950s that many people still carry with them today. If you'd like, we can open that door together. Until then, keep the music close.